it's not about being perfect all the time, right? Like
Exactly.
growing well, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be perfect. It's more about getting started and having a bias towards action. As long as you're being somewhat consistent about 80 to 90% of the time, that is really, really key. That will still have a really, really strong positive impact over time.
Hello, everybody. Happy Wednesday, and welcome back to another episode of Make Up Your Mind. I'm your host, Jahleane Dolnay, and today we have another very special guest, Thamina Stoll. Thamina is an all-around powerhouse when it comes to all things finance, investing, and so on. She is a client solutions manager at LinkedIn and also the founder of the Sheconomist. And the Sheconomist is an education media company that helps young women in tech build seven-figure portfolios. So welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Jahleane. Really, really looking forward to our conversation today.
Yes, no, I totally am too. I think that Thamina has so much expertise to share, and I'm excited to dive into it. So, first things first, what really caught my eye is Thamina has an amazing story where she started with about $2,000 to her name and now is on track to retire with $15 million. Okay, first, in this economy, that's such an amazing feat. I know so many people who are listening to this podcast are probably thinking, like, how am I going to get my money together? How am I going to be able to achieve this wealth? So I would love to hear from you. What's your story behind that? And
Yeah.
yeah, just give us the play by play.
Yeah. First of all, I love that we're starting out with this question right away, like just like hitting it deep, like with the very first question. Love it. Um, so let me preface this by saying I actually used to have a bad relationship with money. In my first
Mhm.
job out of college, I was living paycheck to paycheck. I didn't have any savings. I wasn't contributing to retirement. I was not investing. Granted, it was a very small salary. I think it was like around $28,000 at the time. So, there wasn't that much money to begin with, but I was just like spending and spending and spending. And then when I had the amazing opportunity to pivot careers and join the tech world, I used this new chapter as a reset to build good financial habits. I was also relocating from Durham, North Carolina, where I was living at the time, to Dublin, Ireland for this new job at LinkedIn, which was super exciting. So, new country, new people, new company, new role, new everything. So I was like making that promise to myself, like, hey, Thamina, now it's time. You're like 24 years old. It's time to start, building a strong financial foundation for yourself. So I started educating myself throughout the onboarding process on like all of the employee benefits that my company was offering, which are incredible. And started maxing out all of my employee contributions basically from day one. And I've been doing that consistently without any interruptions over the past 6 years. And now I'm really starting to see that compound interest effect, which I know we're going to be talking about a little bit more later on. But the story is if I kept going like this and I wouldn't even increase my income or my monthly investments compounded, I would end up with about $15 million or maybe even slightly more by the time I turned 65. And that's just from maxing out my current employee benefits working in big tech.
Okay. There's so much wisdom that you just dropped there, but I think it's so amazing to think about how you made that transition. You're saying, hey, this isn't the money that I want to make. And you made the transition from a completely different field into tech where you moved countries and job opportunities. So can you help me understand what were you doing before and then before you pivoted into tech? And specifically, I know you're doing tech sales. If someone's looking to position themselves for a higher paying opportunity, because that $15 million number sounds very attractive to people. What was your process like even making that transition and initiating that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's very, very important question to ask. Um, at the time I was still fairly young, but initially I was on a path towards becoming a journalist. So while I was in college, I was a part-time radio reporter and host. I was studying journalism in school. My dad is a journalist, so I kind of like grew up on television sets and radio studios, as a kid. So that was everything I knew. But then when I had the opportunity to moved from Germany, where I'm from originally, to the US, I was all of a sudden exposed to the world of tech and entrepreneurship in college, specifically through my innovation entrepreneurship certificate, which is basically the equivalent of a minor at Duke University. And that was so intriguing, and I learned so much in a relatively short period of time that eventually I knew I wanted to pivot to the world of tech. And so my first full-time job out of college was a fellowship at my alma mater at Duke University, where I was running their digital marketing or social media efforts. And that was going to be like just like a 1-year program. And so while I was doing that, I was applying for a couple of different jobs at tech companies, like the big well-known companies that we all know, the Googles, the Apples, the Metas of the world, right? And I specifically was looking for some sort of a program that was tailored to the needs of recent college graduates. As some of your audience members may or may not know, there are a couple of tech companies that offer so-called rotational programs for recent college graduates, where you have the opportunity to rotate through different parts of the company, get lots of coaching and resources along the way, and then eventually you end up in one specific, line of business or one specific job function. And so that's what ended up happening for me. I ended up at LinkedIn in a program called Business Leadership Program, which again was geared towards recent college graduates. And because you were asking about how I made that transition happen, I think when you're relatively young, you might still be in college or you might be a year or two out. Um, Oftentimes you still get the benefit of the doubt, where you don't necessarily have to have super hard skill set unless, you go in a very technical role like software engineering. Obviously, you need to know how to code. But for tech sales, for example, it was more important for me to demonstrate my leadership skills. Am I a good communicator? Do I have a self-starter mentality? So I would say for most entry-level jobs in tech, again, with the exception of highly technical roles, it's more about soft skills, leadership experience, and to be quite honest with you, also to be able to sell yourself and tie all of the different experiences and skills that you have into one cohesive narrative that kind of shows the recruiter, shows the hiring manager, okay, this makes sense. This person is going to be able to learn quickly and pick this up in no time, and just take it from there.
Wow. So it definitely sounds like you've really understood how to sell yourself for that position. And so you also previously mentioned that obviously this is a big income pump that you're able to have from journalism into working into tech sales. So you mentioned a little bit about the mindset that you had around money and sort of healing that relationship around money. When you now had access to all these opportunities to make a lot more, can you describe a little bit about that journey you had to really take yourself on to be able to, take the initiative to max out all your company benefits and sort of what that was like for you?
Yeah. So for me, one of the biggest transformative moments that I had was really understanding the power of compound interest and how your age, or rather the age you're at when you start investing, determines your long-term financial success. That was like mind blowing to me once I was actually running through the numbers. So that was my big aha moment. And some of us may hear about compound interest, maybe like in school or college, but oftentimes in a very theoretical context. Rarely do we get the opportunity to actually sit down, look at our own financials, look at, a salary, um, and then calculate that for ourselves, right? That is something that I wish we actually learned in school, but we just don't. So I did that for the very first time, and it was just like mind blowing. So I think there's still a big misconception out there that you need to already be somewhat wealthy or have like a large disposable income, and you need to be super knowledgeable in order to start investing and building a strong financial foundation. When in reality, it's actually the other way around. You need to start investing in order to learn and to become wealthy over time.
No, definitely. We all have to start somewhere, right? And so, for the people who are at that very beginning stage, can you give us a quick overview or definition of what is compound interest? And also, how did you stumble across this? Did you read a book? Like, what were your beginning resources to understanding the financial education of it all?
Yeah, absolutely. We're so lucky to be living in the 21st century because there's so many incredible free resources online now that our parents and certainly not our grandparents didn't have access to. In the past, when you wanted to make an investment in like the 50s or 60s, I mean, back then women probably weren't even allowed to, have their own bank account, right? So you needed permission from your husbands. Awful, but I digress. Um, Back then you had to go to, a physical branch of a bank and oftentimes invest a sizable amount of money. Today, with the advent of technology and, our phones, we can all do that through an app and invest with as little as like $1, which is incredible. So the access to barrier is definitely much lower, and there's incredible resources like Nerd Wallet, for example, was one of the first resources I was seeking out, and then over time, once more and more women started entering the space, which is something that we definitely saw. We saw a big uptick in that throughout the pandemic, like Tori Dunlap, for example, from her first 100K, Simran Kaur from Girls That Invest, Money with Katie, which was acquired by Morning Brew, and so on and so on. So many incredible resources that are out there now. They all blog posts, they have ebooks, they have podcasts. So really today you don't really have an excuse anymore that you don't know like how to get started because there's so much. But I also do get that it can sometimes be overwhelming because now there is so much available information out there that it's like, okay, like who can I trust? Who should I learn from first? So that is one part of your question. And then going back to compound interest. Um it's funny because compound interest is actually often referred to as the eighth wonder of the world. I think that phrase was attributed to Albert Einstein, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken.
I think so.
Okay, good. Okay, cool. So it's basically this concept which allows your money to grow exponentially over time by, and this is important, by earning interest not just on your initial principal, as in the initial money you invested, but also on the accumulated interest from previous periods. So you continue to get compounding interest on compounding interest over and over and over again. So it's really this process of reinvesting interest earnings to generate more interest. Um, and in this scenario, time is the most critical factor in order for you to be able to maximize the benefits of compound interest. So the earlier you start investing, the more time your money has to grow, right? So even small amounts can accumulate significantly over longer periods of time due to that exponential growth effect. So if we look at an example, for example, to make it a little bit more tangible, I was like playing around with a couple of numbers. So let's say, Jahleane, you start investing $100 per month at age 25, which is, fantastic. But then I wait until I'm 35, and at age 35, I start investing $200 per month. Assuming that we have an annual interest rate of 7%, by age 65, usually will have invested a total of $48,000, which will have grown because of compound interest to about $240,000. Me, on the other hand, who waited 10 years, and even though I started investing double, I will have invested a total of 72,000. So how much is that more? Like 24,000 more than you, but my money
Hmm.
will have only accumulated to $215,000, which is a $25,000 difference in total. So despite investing less money, usually end up with more money due to the additional 10 years of compounding that I did not take advantage of. So, and you can play around with like different numbers, um, depending on what your unique circumstances are. But, once I did that, that's when it really started to make sense to me. And I was like, okay, I'm not going to waste another like minute, not another day, not another month. I will start investing now.
Okay, no wonder they call it the eighth wonder of the world.
right?
Right? Because like you take advantage of it and look at how much you're able to benefit. It's interesting because I have heard that the people who do best in the stock market are all dead because they just let their money sit there and then it grew so much
Yes,
over time.
it's the
So,
best. This is so true.
yeah.
It's either the people who are dead now or the people who started investing when they were in kindergarten.
Exactly, exactly. And there are so many ways for parents, if there are young parents who are listening out here,
Yeah.
for parents to like start helping their kids contribute with just a little bit. And even if it's a
Yep.
little bit of money over those 25 years before your child's able to take over, it can grow their portfolios so much. But I digress a little bit. So we're talking about all these big numbers and how much potential
Mm,
there is to accumulate real wealth. But the reality is that so many people are really struggling in this economy. Like groceries are
mm,
so high, the job market, people are
mm,
struggling to get a job and so on. So they might feel like I'm not even able to put in large sums of money, which
mm.
is not necessarily the case. You can put in small sums of money. So, how would you recommend someone start investing if they have only limited funds?
Yeah, absolutely. To your point just now, Jahleane, I think as long as you get into the habit and you're training yourself and your brain that, okay, every month I'm gonna invest something, I think that is a huge start, right? It's an important start because taking that first initial step is always hardest. Um, but I would also challenge you to think about, okay, let me take a step back and assess what my current financial habits are. And something that I usually gravitate towards is recommending to people that they assess their current spending habits, and figure out how much of their current spending is actually deeply aligned with their core values and core priorities in life, because the reality is it oftentimes isn't. And, there's a lot of factors for it. Societal pressure, peer pressure certainly plays an important role here. Keeping up with the Joneses, or I guess in this case, like keeping up with the Kardashians nowadays. um, but I would always encourage people to figure out, okay, what are my top three expense categories that actually have a meaningful positive impact on my life, right? And you prioritize spending maybe 80, 90% of your disposable income on that, right? Something that brings you true joy. So for me, for example, that would be travel. Like my family is abroad, my friends are all over the place. So to me, being able to spend time with loved ones is something where I put the majority of my money. Um, Another thing for me personally, I'm a big foodie. I love eating out. I live in New York, so I spend a good amount of money, like five figures annually, just on food and restaurants, ordering in and so on. On the flip side, things that are not as important to me is, for example, I massively cut back on alcohol. I don't go out in the traditional sense as much anymore as I used to. So I save a lot of money on that. I don't buy a lot of clothing. I rent clothing instead from a subscription service. I'm in a lucky position that, I share rent with my partner, but we're also living below our means because even though we live in New York, only about 10% of our annual income goes towards rent. We could, in theory, afford a much bigger apartment, but we decide, hey, the ability for us to travel, spend money on, good food and convenience, and being able to invest a good chunk of our income in service of, achieving financial independence earlier in life is much more important to us than like having, um, lifestyle creep catch up with us. So that would be my number one recommendation. Try to figure out what are maybe the three expense categories that add true value in your life. What are some of the expense categories that don't add that much value to your life? And then start cutting back gradually in those that don't add as much value to your life, and invest the difference.
No, definitely. I can totally relate to that because there are certain things that, especially when it comes to lifestyle creep and trying to keep up with the Joneses, you realize aren't even actually that fulfilling to you. So, for example, like I love to do my own nails. I love to get press ons. Like, I don't really like going to the nail salon because it takes a really long time. And so
Yep, it
that's
does.
it takes a long time and it sometimes it doesn't even come out the way that you want it to. But if you get your own press ons, you know exactly what you're getting every single time, right? So I think you bring up a very good point about prioritizing what's important to you. And then you aren't really making any sacrifices. You're only benefited with how much money you get back.
Yep. Absolutely. Absolutely. And by the way, it's also, and I really want to emphasize this, it's not about being perfect all the time, right? Like
Exactly.
growing well, you don't have to know everything. You don't have to be perfect. It's more about getting started and having a bias towards action. As long as you're being somewhat consistent about 80 to 90% of the time, that is really, really key. That will still have a really, really strong positive impact over time.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. That consistency is key. Um, and so, through looking at your content and all the information that you share about, you talk about the one thing that money is able to buy you, which is your freedom. And ultimately, also being able to invest and save into an FU fund. Can you talk a little bit about what the FU fund is, why people in their 20s should work on investing and growing an FU fund, and how maybe that has helped you in the past?
Yeah, absolutely. To be fair, I'm also still working on building my own FU fund, which is like, like a sizable amount of money. But because I have such a bias towards investing, I don't like having that much like liquidity, me personally, but I know it's important. So I just wanted to be very open and transparent about that. But I am such a huge advocate of having an FU fund for a variety of different reasons. And I want to preface this by saying an FU fund is actually not an emergency fund. Those are two different things. An emergency fund, anyone should always have, like, actually, way before they start investing, always have an emergency fund. And once you have that, then you can start investing. But your emergency fund is really geared towards very unexpected scenarios, like you get laid off or you have unexpected health expenses, your car breaks down out of nowhere, right? Like that's what an emergency fund is for. An FU fund is designed to support more of those medium to long term goals. And I think this is especially so important for women and young women, because oftentimes we find ourselves in dicey or even toxic environments, such as, maybe an unfulfilling job, uh, abusive relationship, helicopter parents, right? You name it. But we cannot leave because we are financially dependent on that partner, on that job, or those family members. So building an FU fund where you save anywhere from like 6 to 12 months of living expenses really enables you to leave the people, to leave the institutions, and to leave the environments that no longer serve you. So you can just put yourself and your needs first. That's really what it is.
Yeah. And so you bring up a really interesting point that, you are able to get yourself out of these situations because, you know, you have the funds and the means to do so because you've saved up and have been intentional about it. I've even heard someone describe it and the importance of saving around smaller situations that you might encounter day to day. So, for example, if you're out in the city, you can decide to take an Uber home instead of the train because you have a little bit more funds left, right? And you can just afford not to put yourself in dangerous situations. So, it's always important, especially for women, to have that financial agency because the worst thing you can do is be dependent on someone else for your livelihood. It's unfortunate, but it's the reality of the situations that we put ourselves in.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. It's something that is oftentimes very invisible to men and our society as a whole. But we women just really gotta look out for our own best interests, and that very much includes our own physical safety.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, has there ever been a time in the past where, you've utilized your FU fund because you were in a situation and said, I don't have to be here, I'm going to go?
It's a very good question. Actually, I'm lucky that that hasn't happened to me
Hmm.
just yet. Um, but I am currently saving up for a bigger life decision that I will likely be making at some point over the next 12 months in regards to um, my professional life. I cannot spoil too much just
It's
yet,
okay.
but uh, it's no secret. I've been with my current company for 6 years at this point, and at some point, you need to figure out, okay, am I gonna do this and just like follow the trajectory that's laid out for me, for another 6 years, or do I take a risk and bet on myself? And that's where I'm at right now.
Yeah. Well, you know what? We are sat and we're staying tuned for your career moves and your decisions because obviously you put out great content, but it's also really nice following the person behind the journey and behind the content too.
Well, thank
Yeah.
you.
Of course. So, switching gears a little bit. So, we talked about money, we talked about the importance of investing and also saving. Let's do a play by play. Let's say it's someone, or like maybe we're looking at you from when you first got your job and this big salary bump, right? You just get your first paycheck. Okay, this
Mm.
is amazing. What is the split between saving, spending? What would you recommend people do when they have their paycheck hit?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing that I cannot stress enough is automate everything.
Mm,
Because as soon as you have a new job, or even your first job, especially when it's your first job, or when you switch jobs and you get a pay bump, right? The last thing you want is have that lifestyle creep result in you not being able to actually invest and save more, right? So as soon as you join that company, enroll in all of your company benefits, max out your retirement accounts, especially the ones where you get a company match, such as a traditional 401k, right? Because what that does is it helps you to train yourself to live off less money than you theoretically have available. And it puts investing on autopilot, right? So for me, every 2 weeks when I get my paycheck, there is a meaningful amount of money that is automatically being deducted from my gross paycheck. Something goes towards my 401k, something, my traditional 401k, a little bit of money goes towards my post-tax 401k, some money goes towards my employee stock purchase program where I get a 10% discount on my company stock. Then I get my employer match, and then once all of that is done, I still have some investments that go towards a traditional stock brokerage account, and occasionally, some savings as well, right? And everything is pretty much on autopilot. And then the great thing about that is the net pay that I get, which is significantly lower than my gross, right? Especially if you also deduct taxes from that, which can
mhm.
hurt for sure. Um, but that money is significantly lower, but that money I can then spend relatively guilt free because I know I've already paid my future self, as in, Thamina in 5, 10, 20, 40 years from now first. And that is just a strategy that has worked really well for me.
Yes, automating, automating, automating. I totally see that working. And also, it's like when it's gone from your account, you aren't tempted to spend it. Because when you do
Exactly.
see, yeah, when you see those numbers, it's so difficult not to be like, well, maybe I'll just save a little bit more next time, right? It's
Mhm.
easy to fall into those habits. And also, it is funny because, like, when you do see your net income, right, and you see how much is taken out from taxes, it's like, oh, I wish I just didn't see that.
Yeah. Yep, absolutely. Yep. It can definitely hurt sometimes. Yeah, but also maybe to add to that, I know that there is like a pretty commonly referred to, split that says like 50% should go towards, your living expenses like essentials, 30% for discretionary spending, and 20% towards investing/saving. And, this may be a little bit controversial, but I actually think that split is doing especially young people and especially young women a disservice. Um, because I do believe, because of the power of compound interest, because young women usually are not in a place where they have to care for family members or children, right? It's usually just themselves, right? And I think early in life, in those first like 5 to 10 years in your career, you should actually invest and or save more than those 20%. And even if it's just an additional 5%, um, because as we know, because of compound interest, it's going to have such a tremendous long-term impact on your personal finances. So if there's any way for you to figure out a way where you can live below your means and have your living expenses not add up to 50%, but maybe add up to 40% instead, or going back to the exercise we did earlier about your discretionary, spending being aligned with your values. Maybe there is a way to cut back at least like for a quarter or so that your discretionary spending is maybe not at 30%, but at 25%. So you give yourself a little bit of a wiggle room early into your career where you have less responsibilities to really take advantage of that long-term compound interest growth.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you say that about like sort of changing the margins a little bit to fit your long-term goals. And so let's say that someone did decide to have a little bit of that extra 5% where they're saving and investing. I know that some people say you should definitely have it in a high yield savings account, or you should
Mm,
definitely put it in an investment account. For those of you listening, a high yield savings account is basically a savings account that's different than probably what you'd get in your regular bank. It's a whole new account that's external and you're getting more return on your money. So in your traditional bank, you might get 0.01% interest, which back to you, right? So it might be literally pennies after a year, but in a high yield savings account, you might get anywhere from around 3 to 5%, or potentially even more if it's a really good high yield savings account, but probably not. So a lot of people, their strategy is to put a good amount of their money in a high yield savings account, and other people have a strategy to invest it. So, Thamina, what is your
yep.
opinion versus how much should go in a high yield savings account versus how much should be invested?
Yeah. Absolutely. Great question. So both your emergency fund and your FU fund should always be in a high yield savings account because that's the money you need access to either right away if there is an actual emergency or oftentimes within, 6 to 12 months or maybe 2 years, right? Anything that's really any type of money that you need access to within less than 5 years, more or less, that kind of depends on your risk profile as well. But that's usually the guidance. You should have liquid. So anything that you feel like, okay, I don't need to touch this money for at least 5 to 10 years, that money you should invest. Anything else should be in a high yield savings account. And that includes, for example, if you're saving up for a down payment for an apartment or a home, and in general, that should be sitting in a high yield savings account. So to your point, Jahleane, you did a really great job at explaining what a high yield savings account is. So you actually get like a meaningful amount of money and interest every single month. Like the difference sometimes is just it's staggering. I know that when we think in percentages, like 3% from like 0.5% doesn't seem to be a lot on paper, but in the world of finance, that is such a big difference. We're talking about getting, let's say, like $4 a month in interest versus like $500 a month in interest. Like that's like the numbers we're playing with here. So definitely recommend to anyone, if you don't have a high yield savings account yet, that should probably be the first action you should take because it can literally generate some nice like passive income on the side.
Yeah. And to your point earlier, eighth wonder of the world, compound interest, that $4 interest on the $4 month over month over month versus that $500 month over month over month over month, it changes a lot over time. So get into that high yield savings account, y'all. It's going
Yeah.
to, I know personally, it's been nice seeing the little extra hundreds of dollars that I've been able to get into mine. Very informative. Um, and so I know we have a little bit of time left, but a big part of our audience is also facing, student loan repayment right now,
Mhm.
right? And it's a big, it's like a daunting cloud over people's shoulders because usually it's
Right.
20,000, 30,000, 40,000, 100,000 more, right? $100,000 that people are expected to pay back over a long period of time. I know that some people nowadays are like repaying their loans that they've had for 40 plus years, and they end up paying more than their student loans were initially worth, right? So do you have any advice for someone who might have student loans when it comes to the repayment? Because the compound interest works on that as well, right? It's can be a
Yeah.
very tricky situation.
Yeah. Here's the thing, and I'm so glad you brought that up, Jillian, because compound interest can work both in your favor and against you as well, as you
Mhm.
just brought up. So just wanna make sure people are mindful of that. Um, coming from Germany, that was definitely something was like, what? Like, first of all, higher education is this expensive in the US, and then there's like a big like student debt problem that's just is not a thing where I'm from, and obviously I know that's a big privilege, but nevertheless, I decided to go to school in the US, and I have a lot of friends who graduated with student debt. Um, and so this is something I am in a lucky position that I will luckily never be able to like fully relate to because I was able to graduate debt free. But when it comes to the question around should I still invest even though I have student debt, the answer is it depends. It really depends on how high your student loan interest rates are, right? So generally speaking, the guidance is if your student loan interest rate is at or below about 5%, it usually always makes sense to invest simultaneously as well because the average annual return of the stock market historically has been between 7 and 10%. Okay. So what that means is on the flip side, if you have any high interest loans, like definitely 7% and above, you need to prioritize paying off that debt first before you start investing. Like that should be by far your number one priority. Um, so the order in which I would recommend people like go about this, like pay that high interest step first, then build your emergency fund 3 to 6 months usually, uh, then start contributing towards retirement investments, especially the tax beneficial ones such as a 401k or an IRA, Roth IRA, and especially when there's also a company match. And then lastly, you would then start contributing towards a regular stock market investment account.
Got it. And that's a really great visual for people to be able to walk away with. Maybe that will be a good graphic for me to share, but definitely a good roadmap because all these different ways that your money can come in and your money can be taken out without you knowing can be very confusing. But I think that 7% mark is very helpful. So I know we're wrapping up on time here, but I do want to ask, what would you say is maybe some last piece of advice that you would give someone in their early career really wanting to, reach that 15 million mark like you will be when you're retiring? What advice would you give them?
It's a big, big question, I think. And again, this is a little bit of a sobering realization that I had as I was navigating my 20s. I just recently turned 30. And so I really wish I had had someone who had taken me by my hand and kind of like guided me through all of this. So that's what I'm trying to be for you right now. And obviously, with all your incredible work, you're doing that as well, Jahleane. But you really have to learn how to become your own best advocate when it comes to both your money and your career. Rarely things will be handed to you. I think there's a big misconception, especially for ambitious people who, went to all the good schools and they're kind of like used to getting what they want as long as they work hard. The corporate world, unfortunately, doesn't necessarily work like that, right? Your work will, in fact, not always speak for itself. So you really have to invest time and energy in building a strong personal brand at your job and making sure that you highlight and quantify the hell out of your work and the impact your work has had on your organization. It also means being proactive about being very well prepared for performance review conversations. Something that I did early into my career is like I would collect screenshots of either, client testimonials or, shout out messages I got from peers, awards I was winning, or anything really favorable. I would collect that in an I am awesome folder on my desktop and would start sending these updates, attaching some of those screenshots and highlighting everything that I had accomplished that week or that month, send it over to my manager on a biweekly or monthly cadence, and thereby prime them months ahead of the actual performance review conversations that were gonna happening, like maybe 6 months later. So by the time the performance review conversation came around, my manager was very well equipped to advocate on my behalf to ask for a raise, to ask for a promotion, right? So you should not only be having those conversations, the month that they're actually happening. You should prime your manager or whoever has a big impact on your career progression months and months advance. So that would be a big recommendation that I have. And then I know that there are some people who don't like it when people job hop, but the reality is job hopping, at least nowadays, is really one of the only ways to experience meaningful pay bumps. Because you can experience like at least like a 20% increase when you move from one company to another. Again, kind of depends, right? But I have friends who are at their like third or fourth company now, and as a result of that, they've not only been able to take on more responsibility and have more senior job titles, but they've also been able to really increase their salaries by a lot. I don't want to encourage people to job hop too much, but if you do that every 2 to 3 years, I think that's perfectly fine. That also gives you exposure to new networks, gives you exposure to stay in tech, to new technologies, new ways of doing things, like see how people organize themselves at different companies. At the end of the day, your 20 should really be about experimenting, learning fast, and gaining as much knowledge about your industry as possible so you can make more informed decisions.
Yeah. And, it sounds like, you mentioned a little bit about your friends' experiences and them job hopping. So it sounds like you have candid conversations with your friends about money. Am I hearing that correctly?
Well, I'm usually the one who brings up those conversations. Like
Okay.
whenever
Yeah.
a friend of mine has a new job, I ask them, okay, how much more money are you getting? And it's interesting because I've kind of become that go-to person for my friends as well. So whenever, a close friend of mine has a new job offer, they would come to me and be like, hey, what do you think? Like, can I negotiate? And if so, what should I try to negotiate? And obviously I always tell them, yeah, you definitely got to ask for more money. And I kind of like try to guide them a little bit
Yeah.
in that way. But yes, to answer your question, I do have these conversations with my friends, oftentimes to a default.
Yeah. No, I actually would say it's to your benefit because when you think a lot of these boys clubs, they have candid conversations, which is why people are able to elevate a lot faster. So what I'm hearing is that you're having these conversations about topics that might be seen as taboo, but it's helping you and it's helping other people as a result. So where I was getting at is like it's great to have candid conversations about money and also knowing exactly what people are being paid. So that way you're not selling yourself short because you did say you have to be your own biggest advocate and you can only be an advocate if you know exactly how
Yep.
much you can advocate for.
Oh, absolutely. Like, couldn't agree more. Again, especially for women, especially for minorities, especially for first gen college graduates. Um, you never know if you're being discriminated against if you don't have these conversations with your coworkers. So go out there, ask, especially if you're based in the US, please do know that it is your protected legal right, if you are a resident of the United States, to discuss pay with your coworkers. Your employer is not allowed to retaliate against you for having conversations about pay with your coworkers. So keep that in mind, and start out with someone that you are maybe already close with, comfortable with. Don't have to go around and shout out what you're making or like press everyone for like their number. But start out small, and over time that will help you make more informed decisions.
Wow, interesting. Because they really do make it seem like you'll get in trouble if you talk about how much you get paid,
Yep.
right?
Nope. Of
You,
course they don't want it because it's going to make
yeah.
them look bad. But luckily, there's now also laws in certain states. You have to, provide a salary range and a job description, which, you know, sometimes pretty inflated because they would tell you, oh, the salary range for this job is between $100,000 and $300,000, and obviously it's like, okay, like that's not helpful at all, right? So we're not
Yeah.
quite there yet, but it is a start. Um, and yeah, oftentimes people from certain backgrounds massively undersell themselves, and it recruiters who, if you're a recruiter and you have someone who is a minority or first gen college graduate who is massively underselling themselves, I really hope that they would proactively point that out to them. Because eventually, like, they're going to find out, they're going to feel really bad about it, and they're going to leave and tell all of their friends, right? So, I think transparency when it comes to salary is key. It's a difficult conversation, and I get that some companies don't want to do it because it will make them look back and bad initially. But I think this is the only way forward if we want to get to workplaces that are truly equitable.
Yeah, 100%, 100%. I love what you said. And I think we're at the end of time. But Tamina, it was so wonderful speaking with you and just getting to hear your insights because you obviously you're so knowledgeable about this. But I know that so many people are going to walk away with tangible tips to actually get themselves on the right financial track. So thank you so much. And where can people stay connected with you?
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me, Jahleane, and for doing all of the incredible research you did up front. Really, really appreciate it so much. And I love that you are creating and holding space for your community that way. I wish I could have had someone like you when I was younger. So thank you for that. Where people can find me, I'm Thamina Stoll on LinkedIn and on Instagram. And then obviously, if people feel compelled to subscribe to my newsletter, you can subscribe on Sheconomist.com. Maybe we can even put that in the show notes. But yeah, I would love for people to connect, reach out if they listen to this episode. Love to hear your feedback, your thoughts. Yeah, and again, thank you, Jahleane, for having me.
Amazing. Yes, all Tamina's information will definitely be in the show notes. And if you're watching on YouTube, it will be in the comment section. But that's all we have time for today. Thank you once again so much, Tamina, for coming on. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And I will see you next Wednesday. Bye.